Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 547 for the 3rd of Sivan in a regular year. So one thing that's come up in my many years at this point of studying yoga and delving into meditation and things like that, one thing that I've come across is the idea of a candle meditation. So I don't know if any of you listeners have ever experienced participating in a candle meditation, but it can be quite powerful. So what it basically involves is sitting kind of not too far, not too close from a candle, and really focusing on the flame of the candle and really watching it flicker, watching it move, watching the various colors that are inside of this, inside of the flame. And it can bring a lot of focus and alertness and also a state of kind of like calm to the mind. So I think this is really interesting to think about how even in non-Jewish cultures, there seems to be this fascination with candles, with fire, with that kind of thing. And today we're going to learn a little bit about this from a Jewish perspective, what the candle represents. So this is something that's spoken about in quite a number of places in Chassidus. And today we're really going to focus on three main parts that make up a candle, namely the wick of the candle, the oil that's within the candle, so like if we're picturing like a candelabra that's made up of oil, as well as the flame, the resulting flame that comes out from that wick. And this is actually going to bring us back full circle to something which we had discussed previously in the Tanya, and which we brought up a little bit more recently about the teaching of the Hinukah, about this idea of this Chacham einav v'rosho, that a wise person's eyes are in their head. And the way that we describe this is that we said that this is a reference to the Shekhinah, and this is a reference to the fact that a wise person is somebody who performs God's commandments, and through performing God's commandments, this nourishes the oil, which is for the flame of the Shekhinah, so that the Shekhinah can reside and dwell and be revealed above their head. So if you've been following along the past few episodes, then you hopefully are aware of this importance of the Shekhinah and what the Shekhinah represents. And how, just to give like a really kind of give us a little bit of context here for our ongoing discussion, is that the big question that has come up in this bigger discussion that we've been having is, if God is really everywhere and in everything, and there's nothing and no place devoid of God, why is it that we have specific places that we think of as holy? Like we say that the temple in Jerusalem is a very holy place, especially the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. All of these things were considered to be holy. If God is everywhere, what makes these particular places more holy than other places? And by extension, this logic would extend to, if really God is everywhere and in everything, what's the point of doing mitzvahs? What's the point of doing God's will if really everything we do is God is there in everything that we do? So for the full understanding of this and really deepening the understanding, I really encourage you to go back and listen to the past few episodes where we really talk about this in a lot of depth. But the basic answer, and like really brief, is that yes, while it's true that God is truly everywhere and in everything and nothing exists other than godliness, godliness is not necessarily revealed equally in different places. And we talked about the soul. We likened this to the soul, to the human soul. And we talked about how, well, it's true that the soul is found throughout a person and encompasses their entire body. We can say that there is something special about the brain in the sense that the soul is a little bit more manifest from there, and it's kind of like the nerve center and the hub spot from which all the vitality flows to the rest of the body. And so we talked about how this is the equivalent of what the Shekhinah represents in terms of God, and how the Shekhinah serves as this kind of nerve center through which the vitality of the entire universe flows out. And we talked about how the Shekhinah descends from rung to rung, from level to level, throughout the worlds to really vivify each and every world in its own way and according to its own capacity. And then we talked about how while usually there's this natural chain of events that goes through where the Shekhinah becomes more and more concealed and more constricted, there was an exception to this in the first temple where the tablets of the Ten Commandments were found, and how in the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the Shekhinah resided there in a way that really was not so concealed, and it actually was like it surpassed all of those like chain of descent and levels, and it actually like connected right back, and it came right back to its original source, which we said was in Malchus of Atzilus, which is like the source of where the Shekhinah comes from. And then we talked about how in the second temple, while this more miraculous way of transmitting the Shekhinah from its source was no longer there, the Shekhinah still was to be found specifically within the Holy of Holies of the second temple. And then finally we talked about how nowadays, when we don't have any temple, where is the Shekhinah to be found? The Shekhinah is found in the halachos and the Jewish laws, in Torah law, because ultimately Jewish Torah law is God's will and wisdom, and that this is really where the Shekhinah comes from. Like, this is the ultimate, this is what is higher than the Shekhinah, and that's what allows the Shekhinah to become vested throughout all the world, is God's will and wisdom. So this is what the Torah represents, specifically the laws of the Torah and the mitzvos. So this is why nowadays the way that we can really manifest the Shekhinah down here is through specifically learning Jewish law, studying Jewish law, really getting into depth and delving into that. So that brings us to our discussion today, and we're going to talk about candles. So what does this have to do with candles, you may ask? So let's talk about these three aspects of a candle, and then let's also reference back to what the Hinuka said about how in order for us to give oil to that candle that will bring down the Shekhinah, we need to engage in good deeds. So first, let's start off. Let's look at a candle. So again, we're looking at the wick of the candle, we're looking at the oil of the candle, and then we're looking at the flame of the candle. So there's obviously connection between all three of these things, that in order to produce a flame of the candle, which is ultimately what we need, what we want, what we're looking for, that's the purpose of the candle, we need both the oil and the wick. If we just have the oil and no wick, it's not going to work. If we just have the wick and no oil, it's going to burn out really quickly, and we're not going to have much of a flame. We need both. However, in this situation of the oil and the wick, what really gets sacrificed more than anything is that wick. So in order to produce this flame, the wick really needs to give itself over, to sacrifice itself, so to speak, so that the more the wick, and again, we do need that oil for the wick to burn slowly, but nevertheless the wick is burning, and the wick is slowly diminishing in size, and until eventually it becomes totally extinguished, like it's totally nullifying itself for this cause for the flame. So how does this translate into our service of God and to our spirituality, and this whole idea of the Hinuka saying that the oil is the good deeds that allow us to bring the Shekhinah down and all of that? So in the analog, as we'll learn, so yes, the oil are the good deeds, which at first glance might seem kind of strange if like you've seen references to oil throughout Judaism and other places. Usually oil is really a reference to wisdom. It's really a reference more to like intellectual thought. This is one of the reasons why oil is such a prevalent aspect of the holiday of Hanukkah. So the simple idea in the holiday of Hanukkah, and maybe I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but bear with me, is that we know that we eat latkes and we eat donuts that are fried in oil because it's a reference to, and it's in memory of the fact that we found this little jug of oil which was totally pure and had not been tainted at all or impurified, and it was supposed to only last for a little bit, and in fact it lasted for 8 full days. So that's kind of like the simple explanation as to why oil is such a prevalent theme in the story of Hanukkah. But another reason why is because what Hanukkah was really all about was about this idea of the Greeks trying to taint the wisdom of Judaism. They were trying to they were okay with Jewish people staying Jewish and with studying Torah and keeping mitzvahs, but they wanted the Jewish people to just see Judaism and Torah as a philosophy. They wanted to take away the divinity of it. So this was a reference to the oil, because oil, again, usually is a reference to wisdom. So coming back to our discussion today, so if oil is usually a reference to wisdom, why does the Hinukkah specifically say that it's the good deeds that bring oil to this flame that's going to draw down the Shekhinah? So the reason why, as we'll learn, is because we're not just talking about any random good deeds. Like when the Hanukkah says, do good deeds, this is going to build up that oil to bring down Hashem's Shekhinah. So what kind of good deeds are we talking about? Are we talking about just like smiling at a person, bringing somebody, helping somebody cross the street, things like that? Well, maybe that those definitely are good deeds and they might fall into this category. But in a bigger picture, what the Hanukkah was referring to is the mitzvahs, are the halachas, the Jewish law. Because as we learned, what is Jewish law? What is halacha other than God's will and wisdom? So in fact, these good deeds that we're engaging in are wisdom. They're actually the wisdom of God. So this makes sense now why it's a reference to oil. Okay, so now what about the wick? Where does the wick come in? So the wick, as we'll learn, is a reference to the animal soul, the vital soul, which vivifies the body, which, as we've learned previously in Tanya, and if you've been following along, maybe this will be familiar to you, is that in order to do God's commandments, we actually need the animal soul. It's very essential. So it's like at first glance, when we first learn about the animal soul, when we learn about its like really selfish tendencies and how coarse it is, we might feel like we want to just get rid of it and we want to ignore it as much as possible. But then we learn that in fact, no, in fact, there's a really big purpose to the animal soul, and that in fact, the animal soul is essential to God's plan, and it's essential to allowing the godly soul to fulfill its mission, to fulfill its purpose down here. However, just like that wick that in the example of like a physical candle needs to actually lose itself, needs to sacrifice itself for that flame to come about, so too does the vital soul, the animal soul, need to learn how to sacrifice itself, to subdue itself. In the case of a tzaddik, it means really subduing its nature in a full sense, like really transforming itself in a full way from being like this dark, coarse animal really into something holy. And in the case of the Beinonim, which is most of us anyways, it's about really transforming at least the garments of our soul, of our animal soul, to make them a little bit more holy. And then finally we come to the flame, which the flame is that light of the Shekhinah, which we're striving for, which we're trying to manifest here in this world. It's true, pure godliness in an unadulterated format, which is really what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring that down here. And so now we can really understand how all of this works and what the purpose of our lives really is. And it's a really nice way to conclude the Tanya, because again, I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning of the episode today, but today actually is really special because we're concluding the first section of the Tanya, which is called Likkutei Amarim. It's the first book of the Tanya. So this kind of section really brings it all together, and it really teaches us that this is our ultimate purpose, and it's something that's really attainable to all of us, to bring Hashem's Shekhinah down here to rest on top of every single one of us. And the way that we do that is by really working on trying to burn ourselves, to sacrifice our animal souls for this purpose, for the purpose of serving God. Just like the wick's ultimate purpose is there in order to produce that flame, in order to be extinguished, that's really what we're trying to do. So that doesn't mean, when we say extinguish, it doesn't mean, God forbid, like becoming a martyr or neglecting ourselves or anything like that. By contrast, when we actually learn Torah, when we actually see what's asked of us to do, it's actually there to nourish ourselves, to nourish our souls, but in a way where the focus is really on God. The focus is on that Shekhinah, and we utilize every single part of our bodies and our animal souls for this purpose. So let's get straight into the text, and I think we'll understand this a little bit more as we get through it. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he cites the Hanukkah, as we mentioned. So, and this is from the Zohar, and in chapter 35 of the Zohar, where it says that there's a supernal light that is kindled on a Jewish person's head. And this is the Shechina, which requires oil. So then the meaning of this, explains the Alter Rebbe, is this oil. What is this oil? Is that is chokhmah, because chokhmah, wisdom, is referred to as oil, as we were talking about. And so now, furthermore, so what is this wisdom? What is this oil? These are the 613 commandments, which came directly from God's wisdom. So now, in order for the light of the Shekhinah, so in this case, the Shekhinah is the flame, to be able to hold on to the wick, which is, what is the wick? The wick is the vitalizing soul, which is found in the body, which is called a wick by way of analogy. So it just like with a physical candle, like we were talking about in the introduction, the light, the flame happens. Like, how is there a flame on the candle? It's through this wick becoming diminished, through the wick becoming burnt up and annihilated. And this wick that gets burnt up turns into fire. So that this is how the light of the Shekhinah can rest on the godly soul, through the annihilation and like the destruction of the animal soul, and its transformation from darkness into light and from bitterness into sweet. And this is what happens in the case of tzaddikim. So again, just to break that down, so it's like, just like with a physical candle, you have the flame of the candle, and how does that flame get produced? It gets produced through the wick being burnt down. And so then in the analog, what we're talking about is, in the case here, the flame is the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah wants to rest and reside in the godly soul. So the way that it does this is through a similar kind of wick, so to speak, being burnt up. And this, in this case, is the animal soul, which is enclosed within the body. And this transforms like in the ultimate sense, like in the truest sense of how this would happen, is where the darkness of the animal soul would be transformed into light, or bitterness into sweetness. So this is what happens in the case of tzaddikim, where there's this like total transformation. And then now, okay, not everybody's a tzaddik, as we've been talking about at length in the Tanya in many places. So, okay, so maybe not like the actual animal soul will be burnt up, says the Alter Rebbe, but let's say at least like what happens is there's an annihilation of the garments of the animal soul, which is the thought, speech, and action. And these garments transform from darkness of the klipos to the light of God, of the infinite one, which becomes enclosed in the thought, speech, and action of the 613 commandments of the Torah. So this is what happens in the case of the Beinonim. So again, the difference between the tzaddikim and the Beinonim, just a brief review of that, of something we've learned previously, is that in the case of the tzaddikim, they actually transform their soul. They actually transform their impulses, their nature, their animal nature, so that it actually only wants to serve God. In the case of the Beinoni can't actually transform their nature in the same way, but so the best they can do is to transform their levushim, their external garments of the thought, speech, and action. So then what happens as a result of this, where the animal soul that comes from Klipas Noga transforms from darkness into light, then this causes an ascension of the feminine waters. It's called the Main Nukvin. So that's it's a spiritual it's a Kabbalistic concept, which just basically means that there's like a spiritual awakening that happens below, like down here, and this draws down the Shekhinah, which is the revelation of the Or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, of the God's infinite light, into the godly soul, which is found in the brain, inside of the head. And so now we can understand this verse, says the Alter Rebbe, which comes from Devarim, chapter 4, verse 24, where it says, Ki Hashem Elokecha Esh Ochlahu, where it says that here, God, your God, is a consuming fire. So now we can understand what this means by why do we liken God to being a consuming fire? Because we see that actually there is this consumption that has to happen in order for the flame to happen. The animal soul, whether the actual animal soul or just the garments of the animal soul, need to be consumed. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this will be explained elsewhere more at length. So that is it for today, so that hopefully give you a better idea of how it is that our process of serving God is this candle-like meditation. And hopefully this can give you a little bit of a visual in terms of your service of God and how it is that we transform ourselves and our lives. So this is so exciting. I can't believe it. Congratulations, everybody. We've actually finished and completed the entire book of the first book of Tanya, Likkutei Amarim. This is really cool. It's a huge accomplishment. So thank you everybody who has followed along with me on this journey. And I'm really excited to continue when we go on tomorrow and we move on to the next Sefer, the Shar HaYichud VeHaEmuna, which is the second Sefer of the Tanya, beginning with the introduction known as Chinuch Katan. So I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.